Hi, I'm Blair Kaplinger, your host for Business Intelligence, the way it should be. This is a quarterly Google Hangout where we talk about business intelligence, the way it is, and the way it should be, and it's brought to you by Zencos Consulting. Today, we're going to talk about how to maintain a world-class SaaS environment with Nick Welke, the Director of Support Services of Zencos. He's got over 18 years of experience in SaaS admin and support, and he's going to share a wealth of knowledge with us here today. So, Nick, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So what I think we're going to do here is we're going to start and we're going to ask Nick what the State of the Union is. He's going to give us kind of like an overview of what he's seeing. Then we're going to have him share 5 best practices with us. And then we're going to talk about support options. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So Nick, like I said during your bio there, you're in and out of a lot of companies, and so you really would be a great person to ask about the State of the Union of SaaS admin and support. What's going on out there?
What we've seen is that SaaS administration and support can be a real challenge for some companies, and it mainly has to do with having the right resources and skills. In a lot of organizations, for legacy reasons, the business analysts are the ones charged with maintaining SaaS, and that's appropriate in the sense that they know their data, they know how it's going to be used by the business, but they don't necessarily have the IT skills needed to properly support SaaS. On the other side, IT is not really prepared to take on SaaS administration because they're used to either dealing with desktop applications or with larger back-end applications like Oracle or SAP. So you have this gap, a skill gap that exists in a lot of organizations, and what you need is a skill bridge of a SaaS administrator in order to properly maintain a SaaS environment.
So it's a skill gap issue, but so what are the ramifications of this skill gap? What kind of issues does it create?
Well, SaaS is very flexible, but at the same time, that means that it is relatively complicated. So if you have a particular installation of SaaS at your site, it may be configured, even if you have the same products, it may be configured very differently from another SaaS installation with the same tools. So not knowing exactly how it's configured at your site, it can take a significant amount of time to troubleshoot it if anything were to go wrong. And this translates into a time-consuming and unpredictable process, which, of course, consumes a lot of resources.
Yeah, well, time is money. So are there, what are the symptoms that come from this? What kind of symptoms do you see?
Well, very often what that'll translate into is performance degrading over time. Initially, when you first set up your environment, you may be able to support a large number of users or process a significant amount of data, and as time goes by, the number of users who can be serviced or the amount of data that can be processed dwindles without a particular individual cause. So
it sounds like people really aren't getting the biggest bang for their buck that they could be getting. So if companies have this skill gap and they don't have the skills in house, and then what do they do in a pinch? What are the workarounds? Are there any?
Well, very often what ends up happening is that this mushrooms into a situation where the environment is non-responsive and IT will reboot the server. And while this fixes the initial problem of not having enough resources to run the SaaS programs, it does mean that you can be losing metadata, you could be losing temporary work. Any jobs that are running when this happens are obviously need to be started from scratch. So there can be a cost to it in terms of having to redo work that has already been completed, or in terms of having to repair metadata that was lost or corrupted as a result of the Band-Aid.
Ah. So now we kind of know how it is out there. Can you share with us how it should be? Share with us some best practice.
So what we've seen is 5 best practices as experienced in the world of SaaS support. And the first is to be proactive. you have a large number of companies who will install SAS or have SAS come in and install the software for them and more or less leave it alone until something breaks. That may be fine for an Office application, but for SAS, it does require that you have an ongoing, consistent monitoring and error checking procedure in order to make sure that you identify any performance bottlenecks, root out any problems that may be causing individual sessions to hang, clear out any hung sessions, and generally just maintain the environment to make sure that you don't have any warnings that can turn into errors down the road.
So, obviously this probably takes a little bit of time to do. So, how do you justify doing this to people who are time constrained and working really hard? There have to be business benefits. When you're going to break a bad habit, there has to be reasons to do it. So what are the business benefits for being proactive?
Absolutely. So the most obvious business benefit is that it allows companies to deliver continuous system performance improvement and to maintain the ROI that they initially got when they first installed the environment.
So what's the second best practice that you recommend there, Nick?
So the next thing that we've run into is documentation, and documentation not just in the sense of knowing where things are installed and what is installed, but also knowing how it was installed and where and who by and in what way, and having a good solid understanding of the way that your SAS environment is configured can be instrumental in either resolving issues when they arise, but also in training your new staff, or as it always seems to happen, there will be a problem while you're away on vacation, and you want to make sure that you have documentation that is going to be useful to someone other than the person who created it.
So any suggestions or best practices within the best practice of documentation? So when you instruct people on how to create good documentation, how do you suggest that they go about doing this?
What we want to make sure of is that any documentation that is created can be readily digested and implemented by other members of the team. In other words, it shouldn't be the case that a document about the SAS installation, for example, just talks about shortcuts that are or checklists that you would use to jog your memory. Ideally, you want to have screenshots. You want to have detailed path information, detailed locations of where things were acquired, and whom to contact to find new to contact to get more data or more up-to-date information, for example. And you have to assume that the person who will be reading this under the gun while things are broken and everybody's looking at them is not going to be the person who initially installed it. So the documentation has to be clear and meaningful to other people than the original creator of that documentation.
So tell me a little bit about frequent reviews. We were talking before the show, and that was your third best practice.
Yes. So in terms of having a frequent system review, the goal here is to ensure that you cover off any potential security gaps. You want to make sure that any old users, any old connections are being cleared out. You want to fine-tune access to only be granting users the kind of access that they need. For instance, if you have a specific group that only handles password resets, you don't necessarily want to give them access to go and create users as well. Or you may have a group that only handles data access, you don't want them to have user administration rights as well. That all happens through the management console, where you also want to ensure that you have accurate and consistently applied access control lists for maintaining your security policy as defined. And finally, the third purpose of frequent system reviews is to ensure that you are actually auditing the software for use, so that you don't have a case where you may be paying for software that you're not really using. We have had some cases where people will have 25 licenses of, say, Enterprise Miner, and only actually have 10 users who are actively using the software.
So really what you're talking about is, again, it's just getting the biggest bang for your buck. It sounds like this is like instituting a SAS admin wellness program.
Exactly. It's like your annual checkup at the doctor's.
There you go. I guess analogies work. So talk to us about your fourth best practice.
So, in order to use this software as efficiently as possible, you want to have a good understanding of all the various features. SAS is, as we mentioned, a very flexible and continuously evolving software environment, and it makes sense to keep on top of new developments in terms of new functionality, new ways of doing things, more efficient ways of doing things you've already been doing, and additional tools that will be becoming available in future releases. So just being able to anticipate what's happening and also make sure that you are using the tool to its fullest.
So you say continuous learning, so that would imply a schedule. So how do you suggest people go about setting up a schedule of learning, and how should they choose topics, or what do you recommend here?
What we found to work very well is recurring lunch and learn sessions within a customer site. So typically what we would do is either pull session topics from our frequent requests from that customer, or if we know that there is a particular tool set that they use that there will be new functionality or new features available for in future release, or sometimes we get a request for, can you tell us how better we can do X? That all turns into topics, and very often what ends up happening at these lunch and learns is, even though we facilitate the session, we start out talking about a particular subject, there will be a lot of communication between members of the customer staff. It seems that these are good venues to get conversations going internally within the organization.
Great. So it sounds kind of like a win-win. The business gets what it's looking for, and the users learn new things that help them become more productive.
Absolutely.
So, what about future growth? Talk to me about. We were talking about your last best practice before we came on, but tell us a little bit about planning for growth.
So one of the ways that we've seen to ensure that you get maximum value out of your SaaS environment going forward, not just in your current environment, but also down the road, is to ensure that you have a regularly recurring meeting between the analytical team who actually use the software and the IT environment, or the IT team and any other teams such as network security, sometimes financial, you need to get involved, in order to discuss how you see the software use changing, evolving, or continuing down the road. These usually tend to be sessions you'd have once a year. We do have a couple customers who have these sessions more frequently. They have a very fluid environment, but generally speaking, 12 months is a good time frame. And it's a session in which you talk about what your computing needs are going to be in terms of what kind of analysis you want to do from the business side, and then IT can prepare for that in terms of whether or not they need to procure new platform, new products, new networking infrastructure. Maybe some pieces need to be outsourced, and if they do, what are the security implications of that? What are the financial implications of all of these discussions? And that kind of conversation makes sure that the SaaS environment is top of mind, not just within the analytical team, but also within the IT and other teams. And it helps to ensure that your environment grows and is successful in the future.
So, do these planning sessions also include what will be on the horizon from SaaS, so that companies can kind of anticipate what will be available and what they need to do to prepare?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's where either SaaS or a third party such as us would be involved in a session like this in order to help provide some of that guidance or some of that technology knowledge for what is actually being worked on at SaaS.
So, is there any specific time of year or during the fiscal year that people classically do planning? I mean, is there anything you recommend?
It really varies by organization. There's no hard and fast rule for this. I know a couple companies who like to do this right after SAS Global Forum. Other companies like to do it around their fiscal year end. It really depends on how the decision-making process from IT and broader technology is done within an organization. So there's no single answer to that, unfortunately.
So why don't you do this? Let's go ahead and recap what our 5 best practices are. And I know Nick brought some slides today, so he'll share his screen. I'll let him recap, and then he'll go ahead and share some slides as we continue with the program and talk about support options, and then he'll leave us with some parting thoughts.
Okay. So in terms of the 5 best practices, we would strongly suggest that in your SAS environment you should be proactive. In order to deliver consistent performance, you want to make sure that you're maintaining and managing your environment on an ongoing basis. Second, be sure to document your environment extensively, and remember that the audience for the documentation is not necessarily the document creator. This is particularly important in terms of documentation that could be used for troubleshooting, because it seems that without fail, it's always going to be somebody other than the person who created the document who needs to be making the most use of it under the gun. Conduct frequent system reviews. Again, making sure that your software is being used effectively and that any security, potential security holes are being closed off and managed. Instantiate continuous learning to make the most out of the software that you have, and plan for future functionality. And finally, plan for future growth in order to make sure that the SAS environment as a whole is going to be well positioned within your organization.
So Nick, that's awesome. Thanks. Thanks for recapping. Now, again, we had talked earlier, and you were talking about some of the issues about the way it is out there. All have to do with resources and skill gaps. So, in a world of limited resources, what are some of the support options that companies have? Can you share some with us?
Sure. It essentially boils down to 2 alternatives. You can hire specialized resources in-house, and this makes a lot of sense for large organizations where you have fairly complicated, robust SAS environments of hundreds of users. Or you can outsource the administration and support role to a third party, and this tends to, what we've seen is that this tends to make sense for organizations with fewer users, because it's not generally going to be a full-time role that you need to pay somebody 40 hours a week for.
So that gets us into, I know that you guys have an outsourcing service plan that's called ZenGuard. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's structured?
Yes. So as a result of seeing all of this, seeing these gaps in the industry, we developed a software service, a support service for SaaS software called ZenGuard, where we place a team of at least 2 dedicated support professionals who will be proactively involved in managing and maintaining your SaaS environment remotely. So this means usually you set up a VPN, you connect into the environment, you're able to interact with the management console and the other various components of the SaaS environment. And we do this on a plan of a set number of hours per month, and we usually tend to start in most cases at 25 hours a month. That seems to be a good place to begin with most environments. There are some where over time we have one customer who's been with us for 6 years on this kind of engagement, and they have their numbers have reduced from 25 hours to 15 hours at this point, and that's simply because it's a very stable, robust environment that has not had a need, frankly, for more than 15 hours a month of management and maintenance. Other environments, we have another Zenguard customer where they started out at 75 hours because we were very deeply involved in the day-to-day activity of the user base and also of the tools. So it really varies, but for most customers, working around a 25-hour plan has been very effective for us.
So really, the point being made that by having a plan, with dedicated individuals, you can actually get twice the support for half the money, or half the cost of an internal employee. So, but how else does this service differ? I know that some outsourcing services have gotten a bad rap. How does your guys differ from others?
Well, we have all of our support staff are Zencos personnel within North America. Most of our staff are former SAS employees, so we have a very strong relationship with SAS Institute, and as a result, there's a very good pipeline there in terms of having SAS resources and having access to SAS information.
So really, what that translates is that you've got the coverage you need. So when you call, you always have somebody that's familiar with the way your system's architected, the issues that you've been having or could be having, so you can hit the ground running and kind of maybe maximize those hours. Is that sort of the thinking?
That's it. And what we provide is it's very similar to the it's sort of a bridge between an internal resource who is extremely familiar with the SAS with the internal environment, but not necessarily very familiar with SAS in a sense of how it operates outside of the organization. And on the other end of that spectrum, you have SAS tech support who do a fantastic job, but they're not familiar with your environment at all. So they have to, on every single request, on every single new tech support call, they have to find out about your environment, and that can be a very time-consuming and for some users a very frustrating process. So we have the site-specific knowledge of your environment, but we also have a significant amount of history within SAS, and we can draw on a lot of the knowledge that tech support would have. So we sort of bridge that gap as well as the gap between IT and analytics.
Great. Sounds like a good program. So, can you leave us with some parting thoughts? If you want people to remember just one or two things, what would you suggest to them, just to leave them with some parting thoughts here?
Sure. So the thing about SAS is that it's not a desktop application, but it's also not a pure back-end application like an Oracle or SAP. So you can't really think about it in the same support terms as your desktop application. It has to be maintained and looked after on an ongoing basis. You really can't just install it and leave it alone. If you do that, over time, performance will suffer. And the skills necessary to do this ongoing maintenance are not they're not strictly the standard IT skills that you would find in a DBA or strictly the skills that you'd have in a SAS analyst. So there needs to be a mix of, or a combination of skills from both the analytical and the IT side.
All right. Well, you know what? That's about all the time we have for today, and we'd really like to thank you, Nick, for joining us here. That's been great information, and what we're going to do is, if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Nick. What he's going to do is he's going to go ahead and he's going to put his slide up at the end of his contact information. We're also going to be posting a complete set of slides that has some really great information for you on Zencos.com in the resources section for you. So go ahead and check those out. And that's business intelligence the way it should be. Thanks so much for joining us today. Nick?
Thank you. I'm just leaving my email up on the screen. Thanks.